for the my voice is a little bit froggy. They're just a little bit laid up these days, but I had some thoughts on Moses I wanted to share. I was thinking about when he went down to Egypt after being at the Sinai, when the Lord met him at the burning bush. He gave him his name as I am, and gave him 3 miracles to display before the people of Israel to let them know that he was a valid servant of the Lord. And so he goes down. There's the end of chapter 4 of Exodus, and he displays the 3 miracles. The 3 of them were where he puts his hand into his, over his heart, and he pulls it out, and it's leprous. Then he puts it back in, and it's restored again. That's the 1 miracle. And then the second one was when he threw his staff on the ground. It became a serpent, and when he grabbed it by the tail, it was a rod again. And third, to take water from the Nile and pour it out on the land, it becomes blood. Well, when Moses explains who he is and why he's there after all these years, he'd been gone for 40 years, since he had to flee due to killing an Egyptian that the Pharaoh wanted him dead over. The Israelites, who were under great oppression from their taskmasters about their having to make bricks to build their cities, etc. They said, oh, they just worship the Lord, saying, oh, God has heard our afflictions and come down to rescue us. And so now everything is looking up for the first time in their history since days of Joseph after he died. Well, the next day or so, Moses goes into Pharaoh and demands that Pharaoh let the Israelites go to the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord. Well, Pharaoh takes a harsh view of this demand, and he says no. His heart is hard, of course, and the Lord's going to continue to harden it for him. And he makes the Israelites now have to go get their own straw, which is a binder for the mud that they have to put together for the bricks, without diminishing their tally of bricks. So this puts an incredible hardship on their manpower. As you can imagine, they're already dedicated all their manpower to the making of bricks to keep up with the demand. But now they have to go and split up their manpower to go get, and their time to get the stubble, the straw to put things together for the bricks. And they can't do it. And they go, then they're beaten by the taskmasters for diminishing the tally over this. And then they go to Pharaoh to plead for relief from this particular oppressive policy, and he rebuffs them. So now, after all of this, after worshiping the Lord and seeing the miracles, and now that Moses is back, he's their deliverer, they go at Moses and say, what have you done? You've made us bad in the eyes of the Pharaoh and the people, and now they're going to kill us. And what could you just do to us? And Moses then turns to the Lord and says, why have you treated the people so badly and not done anything? And why have you even sent me? For Pharaoh has made their lives worse, and you've not helped in delivering them. So what I realized in reading that part of it was that Moses actually came to a place in his own life where Paul was in ministry in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul talks about being in despair of life. He was talking about his trials and difficulties and pressures that he had while in Asia. Well, Asia is Turkey in their world. And he was stoned. He was left for dead. For example, he was talking about the fact that he said the reason for it was, he said that we had the death sentence in ourselves, that we shall learn not to trust in ourselves. That was the key, not to trust in themselves, but in God who raises the dead. And that's what happened with Moses, really. Moses had already been humbled by life. He started out life, well, in a little basket on the river Nile, but he got raised by Pharaoh's daughter, so he became a great man in Egypt until, of course, he killed an Egyptian to protect a Hebrew who he was beating. And the next day, when he tries to intervene in a fight between two Hebrews, the one that he was saying, to let stop oppressing your fellow countrymen, he said, "What are you going to do? Kill me like you did the Egyptian yesterday?" So with that, he ran because, he knew that his life was in jeopardy. And Pharaoh wanted to kill him. So now for 40 years, he's a shepherd he goes from being famous to being obscure. So now he's back. I mean, he was so humbled by the time he got to 80 that when he was talking to the Lord, saying to him, "Oh, I'm so slow of speech, I can't talk. I'm not good at speech." So the Lord says, "Well, I can put words in your mouth. I can make you talk, right?" And later on, he said, "Please send someone else than me." And the Lord got angry at him and gave him Aaron to be his spokesman, right? So he had been crushed down by life pretty much. But this part right here was so important because now that he has miracles in his hands, so to speak, he is somebody else. He's more than just an obscure shepherd who used to be a famous Egyptian and a powerful Egyptian. He's now a miracle worker, see? And it's here where he comes down to the place of despair at the end of chapter 5 of Exodus. You see, the Lord had to do in him what Paul found out, was that it wasn't just for his sake. The Israelites, who now the day before so was worshiping God over having a deliverer come who was a miracle worker, now they are angry at and pretty much cursing Moses for how bad their lives have gotten since he came. Right? So it was the Israelites that had to learn not to trust in Moses, that he's just a man. Okay. And also for Moses not to trust in Moses, just because he was now a miracle worker. So he was humbled about his natural life, going from being rich and famous to being an obscure shepherd. Now, though, that he has a commission from God and now can do miracles, that he's still not anybody special. In other words, these gifts that the Lord is giving him and anointing him with are so powerful, but he can't hone in on the glory. And that's a very important lesson. And this is what Paul had learned, and what Moses was learning here. And this is what really caught me, was that the Lord deals whenever he has someone in mind to use in a very powerful way in the earth. They go through a time of humility. I mean, you think of Joseph, right, who was betrayed by his brethren, sold into Egypt, ends up being accused of going to seduce Pharaoh's wife, Potiphar's wife. And he ends up in prison for about 13 years, right? But he then becomes the second most powerful man in the world. But after going through all of that, Psalm 107 talks about his trials, how it beat him down. So Joseph, a great man. Moses, a great, great man. Then you can look at Elijah, after the Mount Carmel miracle. When his life is threatened by Jezebel the next day, he runs for his life. And he goes down to Sinai to prosecute Israel to God, saying, basically implying that he should destroy them because they've done nothing but, bad, right? So he's humbled. So we come to the New Testament. We have the apostles. Who's the chief apostle? Who's the number one apostle? Peter. He's the one that prophesies that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. He's the one that walks on water. He's in the Mount of Transfiguration. He's told to keep a secret along with James and John from the other nine about what they saw in the Mount of Transfiguration, you see. But then, of all the apostles, he's the one at Jesus' worst time, in his worst moment, is denying him with oaths, even. They never knew him. Even maybe just hours before, he had boasted that he would go to prison and even to death for the Lord, back in the Last Supper. So he goes back to his old self, and his old self ain't much to brag about. So his own pride is being reduced. But notice what's happening. He becomes the chief spokesman in the book of Acts of the 12. There's only really two speaking apostles. We have Peter and Paul. And every one of them along the line learned not to trust in themselves, but in God who raises the dead. And that comes down to us too, right? When we are serving God, we are not to trust in ourselves. If ministry is effective, if it's there's a lot of people, coming to the Lord maybe through your ministry, or a lot of things are happening around you, boy, that's a time when the same exact issue is going to happen. The same temptation is going to hit, and that is honing in on the glory. And that's something that God simply cannot have in a minister. Paul told us later in the 2 Corinthians, the same book, that a devil was sent to him, a demon, to buffet him, to make his life miserable. Why? So that he would not be lifted up above measure because of the abundance of revelations that he had. He knew it was necessary. He said, so I will now rejoice in them, so that I can retain the power of God in my life. To him, the power of God was the most important thing, but he didn't want to lose it over pride because it's such an insidious sin. Satan is he falls because of this. Pride. The condemnation of the devil, as it says in, I think it's 1 Timothy 5. That's something that God won't allow. And so there's no way that someone who God wishes to use is not going to go through some kind of a humbling of some kind, so that the power is of God and not of themselves. The effect is of God and not of themselves. Not to trust in themselves. See, I'll tell you, you'll notice in every one of these cases, I've only mentioned men. Men are the ones that have always had this problem more than women. Women, see, I think naturally understand dependence, so they're not as given to this kind of boastful arrogance that men are. So I can even think of David now. Look at David's early life, how he had to flee from Saul. There's another good example. He was to be the great king of Israel, but he first went through a lot of trouble to get there, right? So, and this is not to be discouraging. It's just to say that we have to trust God. He's not going to do any more than he has to do, but he engineers the the humbling to a certain degree, in proportion to the desire that he has for that individual to be used. Even Paul said, no matter what we're going through, whether it's light affliction or heavy, or somewhere in between along that spectrum, these current afflictions and sufferings are not worthy to be compared to the glory of to be revealed. It's all like a seed that's being planted in our lives that's going to bloom in eternity. And that's how you're laying up treasure in heaven. In a way, it's being put on you, really. So people with light afflictions, well, maybe not so much as demanded, and that's the way it is. To whom much is given, much is demanded. To whom little is given, little is demanded. That's just the way it is. So it depends on the individual and what God has in mind for that individual when he made him. So he doesn't want people falling from pride. He doesn't want people, even though, and let's go back to Moses for a moment. After Moses goes through this despairing prayer, now we start seeing the miracles occurring. See, now he knows that he's not anybody. But he becomes the face of the miracle to the world. The Egyptians, it says, as time goes on, held him in high esteem because of his word brought plagues. His word brought plagues, and his word stopped plagues. But it was not him per se himself. It wasn't of himself. It wasn't the earthen vessel doing this. It was the glory that it contained doing it. Because you see, God's invisible. God's invisible to us, but his effects are produced in the people of God. So God works with each person to bring about the perfections of glory that he has originally thought of when he first made man for each one of us. See? And that's great. I mean, it's a great thing to know. And so trusting in the Lord with all your heart and leaning not on our own understanding or our own resources or our own talents or whatever it is that makes us proud or give occasion to pride in our lives has to be removed so that we are truly understanding who is who and what is what. That we are creatures of God, we're dependent upon God, but this is our happy state. It is not a happy state to try to be God. Jesus said, I am the vine and you are the branches. Notice the part of that is that it's the branches that bear the fruit. Just like with Moses, the face of the miracle was Moses. He bore the fruit. He was the branch that was bearing or holding that fruit. But the vine is invisible to the world, but not to the branch. The branch has to know exactly where the power is coming from. Then if he thinks it's coming from his own talents or his own abilities or own skills or whatever it may be, if he thinks that that's the source of it or the primary mover of it or something like that, well, then he's a discarded minister. He can't work for God because God can't use someone like that. He's had his fill of proud beings. Okay? So humility, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Why shall they inherit the earth? Because they know where it came from. They didn't come from their own power and their own ability to conquer it. It came because God was merciful to them and gracious to them.